there are chemical addictions and there are behavioral addictions.
Yes.
Now, a lot of people think those are different. They're not. There's absolutely no difference between them. Chemical addictions, cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, sugar. Behavioral addictions, shopping, gambling, social media, internet gaming, pornography, irrelevant. Because they all use the same pathway within the brain. They all use the dopamine pathway, and they all stop at the same way station in an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is the reward center. What that also means is that when you're addicted to one thing, you're addicted to all of them. And that's why we see this phenomenon of addiction transfer.
Welcome to the Mind Health 360 show. I'm Kirkland Newman, and if you or your loved ones suffer from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor memory, poor attention, mood swings, exhaustion, stress, etc., I interview the leading integrative mental health experts from around the world to help you understand the root causes of these symptoms, many of which may surprise you, and suggest solutions to help you heal over the long term. If you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or find us on social media.
I'm so excited to welcome Professor Robert Lustig and Dr. Don Grant, both of them actually from California. So one's from San Francisco, the other's from Los Angeles, and we're here in London.
They have nothing to do with each other.
They're very different. But
give us back our water.
But it's quite funny to have them here in London, and we're actually going to be talking for Mind Health 360 about tech addiction, and very interested in especially the biochemistry of tech addiction. And Professor Robert Lustig is Professor Emeritus of Pediatrics, Division of Endocrinology at the University of California, San Francisco, and he specializes in the field of neuroendocrinology with an emphasis on the regulation of energy balance by the central nervous system. His research and clinical practice is focused on childhood obesity and diabetes. He holds a bachelor's in science from MIT, a doctorate in medicine from Cornell Medical College, University Medical College, and a master's of studies in law from UC Hastings College of the Law. Wow, you're a lawyer as well as a doctor. That's impressive.
No, I did 1 year of law school.
But that's still very impressive.
So I can't sue, but I can talk to people who can.
Very cool. And he's written 2 books, right? So his New York Times bestselling book called Fat Chance, Beating the Odds Against Sugar, Processed Food, Obesity, and Diabetes. And he looks at both the science and the politics that have led to the current pandemic of obesity and chronic disease. And his latest book, which is the one I'm fascinated by, called The Hacking of the American Mind, he explains his view that our current corporation-driven societies are hacking our bodies and minds to pursue pleasure instead of happiness, fostering today's epidemics of addiction and depression. So let me know if I need to add anything or if I've got that more or less right.
It's as short a capsulization as you could make it.
Perfect. So there's a lot more, but we'll leave it at that. And then Don Grant, Dr. Don Grant is an award-winning media psychologist and addiction specialist. He's the executive director of Resolutions Teen Center, an intensive teen outpatient treatment program in Santa Monica, and he's the founder and CEO of Unboot Camp, which assists teens, young adults, and families struggling with device, social media, gaming, and cyber pornography addiction. He's also the co-chairman of the American Psychological Association Device Management Committee and has been commissioned by the APA to write on healthy device management and the practice of good digital citizenship. He regularly appears in the media, sharing his expertise in the psychology of addiction and recovery, including appearances on The Daily Show, Fox News, and in publications including the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Forbes. And I'm sure that you also, I didn't mention all your media appearances, but I know that they are absolute multitude. So I'm personally fascinated by the biochemistry of addiction. And so we have, and I hope this is okay to say, but Don Grant is a recovering addict.
Sure. And
is an addiction specialist. Robert, I don't think that you're a recovering addict.
No, I'm still addicted to caffeine.
You're still addicted to caffeine.
And if you take my Starbucks away from me, I will kill you.
I'll just put you in rehab.
And so what I'm particularly interested in is the biochemistry of addiction, what causes addiction, and especially in the realm of technology. I know that a lot of parents and a lot of people are struggling with tech addiction, whether in themselves or in their children and their teenagers. in terms of, and Dr. Greenfield, who runs a Center for Tech Addiction in Connecticut and has just started a 30-bed facility for tech addiction in Connecticut, was saying the other day at ICAD, the addiction conference, he said, the internet is like having the world's largest slot machine on the world's smallest slot machine, i.e. your cell phone, in your pocket 24/7. And so I know that a lot of parents, a lot of people are struggling with this, and I want to understand, what is the biochemistry behind it, and also how is it affecting our teenagers and our children when they're on these machines and on these devices all the time? What is it doing to them long term, and is it priming them for addiction long term? Because this is my big concern as a parent, and a lot of people are concerned about. So,
Indeed.
Who wants to start? You want to start?
I'll start. So, first of all, there are chemical addictions and there are behavioral addictions.
Yes.
Now, a lot of people think those are different. They're not. There's absolutely no difference between them. Chemical addictions: cocaine, heroin, nicotine, alcohol, sugar. Behavioral addictions: shopping, gambling, social media, internet gaming, pornography. Irrelevant, because they all use the same pathway within the brain. They all use the dopamine pathway, and they all stop at the same way station in an area of the brain called the nucleus accumbens, which is the reward center. And dopamine drives all of those. What that also means is that when you're addicted to one thing, you're addicted to all of them. And that's why we see this phenomenon of addiction transfer. You stop smoking, you start drinking, you stop drinking, you start eating, and back and forth. The problem with dopamine is it gives you pleasure, and there's nothing wrong with pleasure. I'm not against pleasure. Let's make that clear. But it's supposed to be relatively few and far between. It's supposed to be special. It's not supposed to be 24/7. It's not supposed to be chronic. The problem is that dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter. So when dopamine is released from one neuron in the nucleus accumbens, it binds to a receptor on a second neuron. And when that receptor is occupied, that neuron then fires. And that is the transduction of the phenomenon we call pleasure, which is all good, except that because dopamine is an excitatory neurotransmitter, neurons like to be excited. That's why they have receptors. But neurons like to be tickled, not bludgeoned. Chronic overstimulation of any neuron anywhere in the brain will lead to neuronal cell death. Neurons do not like to be constantly stimulated. And we know this because as a pediatrician, we take care of children who end up in the neurologic intensive care unit in status epilepticus, that is chronic long-term seizures that will not stop. And we have to put them into pentobarbital coma to actually calm their brain while we get hold of their seizures. Otherwise, we fry their neurons and they end up quite developmentally delayed.
Interesting.
So this notion that you can just let a neuron fire willy-nilly nonstop, that cannot stand. Well, so this area of the brain, this nucleus accumbens, it doesn't want to die. So there's a self-defense mechanism. It has a plan B. It downregulates the number of receptors so that it's less likely that any one dopamine molecule will find a receptor to bind to, so that there's less amplitude, less gain in the system. So that's how it protects itself. So what does this mean in human terms? You get a hit, you get a rush, receptors go down. Next time you need a bigger hit to get the same rush, and the receptors go down. And then you need a bigger hit, bigger hit, bigger hit, until finally you need a huge hit to get nothing. That's called tolerance. And then when the neurons actually do start to die, that's called addiction.
Interesting. And so essentially, one of the theories from your book, The Hacking the American Mind, which I thought was so interesting, was that basically in our societies, we're primed culturally to seek out pleasure the whole time and conflate it with happiness. And so essentially we're sold pleasure by technology companies, sugar companies, processed food companies, gambling companies. These hits of pleasure we're told by advertising companies, etc., that, this is going to bring you happiness. And yet, in your book, you make a very compelling argument for the fact that there's an inverse relationship between dopamine and serotonin.
Indeed.
Serotonin being our happiness and contentment neurotransmitter, and that this is a profound issue, not only in terms of what you were describing in terms of downregulating dopamine, which means that you need more and more and more in order to get less pleasure, essentially, which you then say leads to addiction. But also, we're getting more depressed as a nation because we are pursuing pleasure at the expense of happiness.
Indeed. So all of the things that make dopamine go up, and I can give you all 5 things that have happened in the last 50 years. Technology, processed food, sugar, sleep deprivation, drugs.
Yeah.
Those 5 things all drive dopamine. They're all addictive.
Yeah.
They also, all 5, contribute to biochemical changes in the body we call metabolic syndrome. That is type 2 diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, lipid problems, obesity. And those lead to low serotonin. Now, when you throw some stress on top of it, because stress disinhibits that dopamine, which makes things go worse, and also stress reduces the number of serotonin receptors, which means even less likelihood that a serotonin molecule will bind to its receptor. So addiction on one side, depression on the other side, 2 sides of the same coin, driven by the same 5 things that we have done to our society in the name of, quote, happiness.
Exactly, which is fascinating. And then in terms of understanding addiction, because, there one of the things also that I'm very interested in is what causes addiction. And so, are we born with certain predispositions to addictive behaviors and substances? Maybe there's a theory that we're born with, a higher need for dopamine or lower serotonin or lower beta endorphins or, a brain chemistry that primes us for addiction. Or is it, as we know also, trauma and adverse childhood experiences that create, a high correlation with addiction. And then how much is this about society and driving towards pleasure at the expense of happiness? So there's these 3 sort of things that you see, which are a sort of genetic, biochemical predisposition, adverse childhood circumstances and trauma, and then our society, which is extremely stressful and which is pushing all these pleasure behaviors and substances on us. So that's sort of the perfect storm for addiction. But I'd love to hear also from Dawn, who is a recovering addict. What is your view of the cause of addiction, essentially?
I was going to say, I don't know why you have us here. You got it all right.
I feel like this is my intervention. Okay, so yes, I've been in recovery for almost 18 years now, but I've also worked with literally thousands of people who struggle, and they struggle on very varying spectrum, varying places on the spectrum. When we look at addiction, as human beings, as animals, I think if you had a choice, you said, are you going to chase pleasure, or are you going to chase pain? Whether it's physical pain, emotional pain. So what are you going to choose? You're going to choose pleasure. We also, at a certain point, when we're working with rituals and routines, when we're working with, you name some of them. So the big 3 that people know. So it's dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. So if you had a choice, I think that we would all just like to be hedonistic and always have pleasure. That's just a basic human. That does not mean that you're an addict if you like to just live a life that's full of pleasure. And it seems like that would be a really great life if you didn't have to work and you didn't have stress and you could just, be happy and just chase pleasure. The problem is what he was talking about is that these neurotransmitters need to be in balance. When you start introducing something, for example, one of the strongest ones is cocaine. Cocaine will flood the brain with dopamine. The hardest cases, and this breaks my heart, I worked, with a lot of crystal methamphetamine addicts. One of the many, many, many of downsides of that particular drug, and I still try to find something positive. Sorry, tweakers. There's a crystal methamphetamine use that reaches a threshold, and once it goes past it, and this just makes me so sad, the dopamine producing centers will shut down completely forever. They will never, ever open back up, because what you've done is you've reintroduced in an inorganic way dopamine. And the best hope that someone who is a crystal methamphetamine user has once they recover for feeling pleasure is maybe you can put them on some psychotropic medication, but they're never going to feel that organic pleasure. And what he was also saying in terms of dopamine, we get dopamine hits all the time. I get a dopamine hit in the morning if my alarm goes off and I just give myself the idea I'm going to hit snooze for 10 minutes. It's very small, but but I still am a little happy. So, but we're organically exposed to all sorts of opportunities to have dopamine. Right now, the way you're looking at me and you're smiling, I'm getting a little bit of satisfaction. I'm getting a little bit of it sitting in this nice place, drinking some coffee, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But see, then there's the drug piece. So for people who are really trying to anesthetize or trying to assuage whatever they're trying to do in terms of their pain, when they are introduced to something that relieves it, the problem is if they start and continue doing it, you start to create a neural pathway cycle and circuit in your brain, and you start to reinforce and recondition. I'm going to leave that to him. I'm talking about the basic kitchen table terms. I'm going to switch this over a little bit because I think that the big thing now, if I say, Fortnite,
Yes.
anywhere
Just talking.
anywhere where there's parents, the kids get a shot of dopamine in their head and the parents' heads explode as cortisol starts flying through their head. So, but I get a lot of parents who say, oh my goodness, I can't believe it. I don't even understand. I used to have a really, really wonderful, lovely child. And then they're playing this game and I go to try to pull them off the game and they turn into an animal and they bit me.
Yeah.
And I heard this more than once.
Yeah.
Well, I say to parents, look, you have to understand what's going on in their brain. You have a lovely child, but they're in the game and they are put in a game that is so overstimulating and it has blocked out everything else, and they revert back to that primordial lizard brain because they're playing a game where all executive functioning and decision making has really gone out the window. And for those people who don't know, the executive brain, they call it the new brain. It's old. It's been around a minute. But our first brain was our primordial lizard brain, and that's about fight, or freeze. It's the survival brain. It only seeks certain very basic things. So we put a kid in Fortnite, and you're basically putting a kid in a jungle, in a war. And they revert back to that survival brain. And what's running through their head is dopamine, cortisol, and adrenaline. That's the primary. Now, there's other things, of course, because they have to survive and keep the ecosystem working. But that's really primarily what is rushing through. Is oh my God. And the parents try to pull them out. And I say, it's like you're trying to pull a soldier out of the middle of a war in the jungle. And then you would like them to please sit down at the table and do their homework and have a lovely supper.
Yeah.
So, in terms of addiction, they tried to isolate and they thought they had, and this was, I'm not going to lie because I tell the truth because I work with life and death. And I've buried too many people. And I'm in recovery myself. So we all want to know what's the reason for addiction. And I'm going to tell you there is no reason for addiction. Mm-hmm. I have had families, you can talk about a congenital piece. I have done genograms and ancestries on a client. There is absolutely no substance abuse addiction that can be identified. But we don't know about the process addictions that could be in their family because those are a little quieter. A few years ago, scientists claimed that they had identified the predictor and the gene for addiction, and every addict said yes. Why? Because the addicts wanted to say, see, it wasn't my fault. I was born this way. Okay, hashtag Lady Gaga. Maybe you were and maybe you won't. But there's so many reasons of why someone becomes addicted. It can happen very insidiously and very slowly. Yeah. And we're seeing that now with some of the stuff. I don't think that kids are born gaming addicts. But what happens is when you reintroduce this or you introduce something like that, and you start to create that dopamine rush, and it creates this pathway, and you start to exorcise out any of the other things in their lives. They just start to focus on this. Addiction creeps up slowly. So we talk about the terms and the stages of addiction a lot, and we try to trace back where it started and where it stopped. The best thing to do is if there are markers or there are indicators, then we can intervene on it and try to get ahead of it before it becomes a full-blown addiction. That's difficult to do because, unfortunately, most people only seek help
when it's too late.
When there's a crisis.
crisis. Because one of the things that I was interested in, for instance, I have two boys, one is 10 and the other is 13.
Oh,
The
dear.
13-year-old is, he's always been obsessed with his dummy, with sugar, and now with Fortnite. And Fortnite, he will play 16 hours a day and he won't eat. And he's actually lost his appetite. And he's not interested in sleeping and he's not interested in eating. Now, to me, those are signs of addiction, essentially. Slightly nervous about saying this on camera, but yes.
Wait till he sees this.
They are counting on him not seeing it. My 10-year-old is completely different. He's never been interested in sugar. I mean, a little bit, but nothing out of the norm. He'll play Fortnite, but he can take it or leave it. And he's always had an ability to sit on his own and play for hours without sort of external stimulation. He's a very grounded, calm kid. The other one is quite anxious. And so I'm wondering, same parents, same environment, like what is the difference and what is the trigger?
What I can say is sugar is the cheapest of thrills. It used to be rare, and now it's everywhere. And not only that, but even your grandma's a pusher.
Oh yeah, big time.
So it's
so
it's a problem. I actually show a video clip of Eric Clapton talking about how he became an addict, and he started 5-6 years old putting sugar on bread and butter. And he said, I became addicted to sugar because it changed the way I felt. This is from 1978 interview he did with Ed Bradley on 60 Minutes. So, that is how children often manifest their addictive potential, because it's the first
thing that
hedonic substance that they're exposed
I'm also going to suggest to you that parents do this too. Parents think nothing of giving their kids a breakfast that is a Pop-Tart and a donut and a bunch of cereal with sugar on it. They don't know, but then the kids get all juice. And the orange juice. And the kids get all heightened and all activated, and they like that feeling. One of the things that when I work with bipolarity, when I work with bipolar clients, they'll readily admit they do not miss the depression, but they really miss that manic, and they will play with their drugs to try to get that manic. So,
well, I think all you have to do is go to an AA meeting
and
find out about the rock stars and the brownies, in the back room. Yeah. So, I mean, basically that's your addiction transfer. Yeah. I mean, you basically have moved from an addiction that was socially unacceptable to one that is more socially acceptable.
Or vice versa. So when you're a kid, you're moving from addiction that's socially acceptable, i.e. sugar. What my fear is that then that primes you to move on to a more socially unacceptable addiction.
Well, I have a question for you, though, because if the kids don't know and the parents are just giving them sugar breakfast from the time they're born, and then they get, they don't even know that they're addicted to it, I'm wondering about, and you would be the expert, about how that affects the way that even their brain develops, how their body develops. Are they being prone for childhood diabetes?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the short answer is all the above.
Okay.
The data demonstrate that this new brain you were talking about, it's prefrontal cortex. So it's this part of your brain right here, right behind your eyeballs. It is the executive function center. It is the inhibitory center. It is the part of your brain that predicts the future. It's the part of your brain that tells you not to do stupid things. Right? It provides reasoning, it provides deliberation, provides ability to take multiple streams of information and parse them. It tells you what not to do because there are consequences. And when that part of the brain becomes dysfunctional, basically, you become an intuitive organism rather than a deliberative organism. Right. And that is what we're seeing. And we're seeing it in terms of school performance, test scores, and we're seeing it in terms of predisposition to addiction, especially during puberty, when stress gets high and sex hormones change dopamine responses, especially in girls. And we're seeing it in terms of depression, because all of those things, particular sugar, they down your serotonin. So these things all feed on each other, and it really becomes manifest during puberty. And children are particularly prone to all neurobehavioral disorders during puberty. And there's a reason for that, because that prefrontal cortex, that area of the brain, the executive function part, it is the last part of the brain to myelinate, that is, to develop the fatty sheath around the neurons that protect them and allow them to work faster, better, smarter, longer. So a simple way to think of this. You have a battery, a 240 volt battery, and you've got two nodes on it. And you have two wires. One is a copper wire, so long, so wide. The other one is exactly the same copper wire, except it's got insulation around it. It's got a plastic insulation. You put either wire across the battery. Which one's going to short out first?
The one that's not insulated.
The bare wire. Mm-hmm. The bare wire is going to short out first. How come?
It's too charged?
No, because the insulation increases the resistance. And for the same voltage, that decreases the amperage, and it's the amperage that shorts the wire. Once upon a time, our houses used to have fuse boxes before circuit breakers.
Yeah.
And what was a fuse? A fuse was a bare wire that was in a little round thing that you could unscrew. And if there was a power surge to the house, that would short and break before the house caught on fire.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So same concept in the brain. So neurons that are not insulated, not myelinated, this fatty sheath that develops during puberty and finishes about age 25, which, by the way, that's why the actuaries reduce the insurance rates on auto insurance after age 25, because they know.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why children are so vulnerable to all addictions. Yeah. But of course, technology being the one that is now being proffered at school.
Absolutely. Well, this is the other problem is at school, they need technology to do their homework, and they need, and so, you can't even take their phone away because they say, well, I need my phone.
Well, you can.
Well, yeah, but I mean, then he'll say,
you can.
I need my phone to do
because
my homework.
The problem is, and I've been to a lot of schools, and I'm sorry, I'm still processing when you said that. I haven't heard that in a while. It may or may not have been that I was assigned what I felt was the worst topic, and I, in graduate school, may or may not have had to do an entire paper on myelin sheath. This is not the most robust and interesting of subjects, but he said that I had a little PTSD about having to do that paper. But there's a few problems about this. I go to a lot of schools. I also do a lot of kitchen table observations because I'm a geeky researcher, kind of always interested in the world kind of thing. I go to these schools, and I don't know how it is in the United Kingdom, but I'm from Los Angeles, and I walk through a school. The teachers are on their phones. The teachers are on their computers. But no, you absolutely do not need to have your phone. But in the classrooms, the teachers are so overwhelmed, I guess. Pause. The kids are watching Netflix. So the academic piece of having to have, because as you know, I don't teach abstinence. I'm not trying to do that. That would be ridiculous. I teach healthy device management and the practice of good digital citizenship. So I'm not demonizing technology. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't use it. It's a tool.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's a tool. Yeah. And tools can be used for good.
Well, a hammer
bad.
Can be used to build a house or smash someone's head in.
Nuclear reactor, nuclear bomb. Ultimately, how a tool is used is dependent on the user.
I think part of the problem
and
is that we're putting...
And the developer.
We're putting power tools in the hands of kids and teenagers, right? I mean, we would never give a teenager or kid a nuclear bomb, or we wouldn't give them, and yet we're putting these power tools in their hands. And so the question is, what do we do about this?
So you have these two areas of the brain, and they're in contact and reciprocity with each other. You have the reward center, the nucleus accumbens, the dopamine center. And you have the prefrontal cortex, the executive function center. And the dopamine tells the prefrontal cortex activate, and then the prefrontal cortex tells the dopamine calm down. Yeah. So you have this nice servo mechanism of negative feedback that keeps things in check.
Yes.
Until you throw some cortisol into the mix. Cortisol being stress hormone, comes from the adrenal glands, circulates, goes to the prefrontal cortex, and puts it into suspended animation. So you have now disinhibited that servo mechanism. And what you've done is you've then taken a negative feedback pathway and turned it into a positive feedback pathway, thereby running this constant dopamine downregulating its receptor, causing more and more for less and less, and driving the addiction. So reward is dopamine, An addiction is dopamine plus cortisol.
Cortisol.
You need
Okay.
both.
That's fascinating. And Don, from the perspective of the practicality of addiction, would you agree with that? That it's dopamine plus cortisol, i.e., it's the stress, so whatever trauma or stressful situation you're in, which then, with the fact that you downregulated your dopamine receptors and you need more dopamine. Would you agree with that practically? And also, I have one more question, but I need to, does the fact that when you're stressed, does that automatically create a desire for more dopamine?
So let me just quickly answer that. The stress is built into each of the various reward pathways, whether it be chemicals or whether it be technology. And that stress is called the like button.
Okay.
That is the variable reward. That is the stress.
Okay.
And so that has been built in. Now, it doesn't have to be built in, but it's been built in by Facebook, by Instagram, by Reddit, etc., very specifically to generate that variable reward, to generate that stress, to generate that addiction, because it's all about eyeball time.
Interesting.
That's the business model.
Yeah.
So it's been engineered into these products specifically to addict you.
So stress essentially can mean, just the excitement of getting a like or the sort of anticipation, but it could also be childhood trauma. So, both of them release cortisol, adrenaline, etc. Right. And would you agree in terms of what addiction is, in terms of, the definition of stress plus dopamine, cortisol plus dopamine? That's sort of the perfect storm for addiction.
I'm not going to absolutely say that because, again, I've worked with thousands of addicts. But what he's saying, it's what I've talked to you about a little bit. So when I look at a client, what he's talking about and the expertise, the brilliance of the way that he explains this absolutely is correct. Because when I'm looking at any client and we start to evaluate and try to see what's going on, I told you I go in this order. This is just mine. Yeah. I first look at biological basis, then psychological basis, then sociological basis, then occupational, academic, and then environmental. I go in that order because the bio bases that he's talking about are not only the ones that can be the toughest ones, they can also be the easiest ones to reconcile. And there's a lot of ways to do that. You're talking now, you're moving into my world. So my lane is a psychological lane. And, because I've shared this, when he's talking about the like button, Leah Pearlman, who invented it with her partner, has disengaged it. And I told you that she's compared herself to Oppenheimer, which I think is really lofty because I think he invented the atomic bomb, but maybe it can be correlated because she realizes. Now, what he's also talking about, and now we're finding this out, we knew this. We've always known this. I'm a media psychologist, and we knew this back in the beginning, that the social media especially, and the gamers, I'll talk about that in a second. For the social media, they were charged with the task of leveraging flaws in the psychological makeup. One of them is the variable reward system. They found flaws. And so the designers and the people who invented these social media brought in psychologists and said, okay, how do you keep them engaged for as much time as possible? Absolutely. And it's not about keeping us engaged. It's about monetizing it. Completely. So it's about rebranding us with all of those ads and whatever. So they know that. But now they're all realizing, and some of them are saying, this was wrong, but it's already happened. Gaming. I've sat with gamers and really tried, game developers, and really tried to be not me, meaning that I'm going to call it out, as they boast about the Easter eggs. They're called Easter eggs that they put into the games. They get bonuses for this. It's a competition between game developers to see who can put in the best, most enticing, most interesting little Easter eggs. And I'm not talking about a chocolate egg you hide under the couch. I'm talking about little things in the game that will keep the player playing. Little things they can bond over. Did you find this? Did you see this? I got this. They monetize it as well, but they also keep you involved by giving you different things you can earn. You can get skins. You can get different little weapons. And their goal also is to keep you playing. certainly something like Fortnite. And this is going to become so antiquated because the problem with what I do is state of the art in the morning is obsolete by noon, and augmented reality and virtual reality are just going to take this whole thing upside down and change it. But with Fortnite, what I talk about is there's a different thing. Adults find this. Do you think that it's a coincidence that now, instead of having to wait every week to see what the next TV show is like we used to, now they'll drop an entire series in one day? What do you think they're trying to do? Because they're lazy? No, they're trying to keep you engaged. Why do videos have suggestions for next? You say you're only going to watch one, and suddenly, oh, I need to see that. I need to see that. Like a crystal methamphetamine or a stimulant user like cocaine, I have people who are videoites or videophiles or video addicts, whatever you want to call them, who are up. They started early in the evening, at 6 o'clock in the morning, the birds are coming up, and they are just spun because they stayed up all night. The last thing I'll say is the architectural design of Fortnite. So something like Call of Duty or something like World of Warcraft, some of these games that go on and on and on and on. So then they say, oh, that's bad. And the kids will say, but Fortnite's it's only 100 players. No, they actually got brilliant. It's the Hunger Games. And what happens is that they get the kids ambitious, they want to achieve. And a lot of them are playing with another kid that they know. So not only do they have a goal to beat your son, who they have a competition, your son's their nemesis. And so if I get called out at 72, then he's still playing. I've got to go back in and beat him the next time. But when you say that only one person can win, and we are also human beings, and we are also are achievers, and we also want to survive and win. And you have a game like Fortnite where only one person wins. Even though they say it's only half an hour, no, it's not. It goes on forever because only one person can win. And I'm competing against maybe my nemesis, but I'm also always want to do my personal best. So if I'm playing and I get, killed out at 62, but my personal best is 42, I go into depression, I go into a shame spiral, I get really aggressive, I got to beat that, I got to go back in, and I've got to do better than 42. So the setup of these games, and parents need to know this because parents are buying them for them. Parents are introducing them to them. The last thing I'm going to say, and this is a warning for you parents, I want you to understand, and I'm looking right at the camera, when you have a kid who's in a massive multiplayer game, and you let your 10-year-old child go into that game, you need to realize that you don't know who else he's playing with. So he could be playing with 25 and 30-year-olds. He could be playing with predators. You don't know who they are. I don't think you would let your kid go out at 10, 11, 12, 13 years old and start posting up and hanging with a 25-year-old guy. So you need to be very careful when you look at these massive multiplayer games. You do not know who else is playing. And there are people, and I know it's dark, but you need to know it and you need to get woke. There are people who go on these games specifically to hunt. And I've heard all kinds of stories, whether it's trying to abuse a kid, or just, hey, why I can't buy any more skins, and your son thinks the other kid is the same age as him, and he's saying, oh, I don't have enough skins, I can't get any money. And then your son says, oh, that's okay, I'll just get my mommy's credit card, I want to keep playing with you. Yeah, and then your credit card's given to someone who went on there. Absolutely. That's the end. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, look, it's a huge problem. And I mean, the question is, what do we do about it? And
the solution? So... Oops. I'll give that to him. Thanks.
I mean, and the other thing about tech addiction...
You wrote the book, you got it.
It's complicated because essentially, with cigarettes and alcohol, you can sort of say, okay, there's nothing good about it, abstinence. But you cannot say abstinence with technology. So what do we do?
I totally got it. So...
I knew you did.
I mean, I got it, but I don't.
But you
got
it.
None of this is a global problem. This is not a little problem, and it's also not a personal problem. This is a public health problem. Yeah. Now, all public health problems require individual intervention, which, for lack of a better word, we can call rehab, and societal intervention, which, for lack of a better word, we can call laws,
regulation
of some sort.
Yeah.
Okay? Rehab and laws.
Yeah.
Work for tobacco, work for alcohol. Ultimately, what we have to do for any hedonic substance or behavior is we have to come to peaceful coexistence with it. Yeah. We did that for tobacco and alcohol, but it took years, generations to do that. And part of the reason was because of the dark forces pushing back, because there was money to be made. Yeah. I'm working on that with sugar. right now. As you know, there is a sugar tax here in the UK, very specifically because of this issue for diabetes, but in part because of addiction as well. So the question is, how do you ultimately impart some sort of regulation framework onto something that is basically the Wild West, the internet?
The Wild West, and also something that has so many advantages that, it's even more
Well,
complex.
as we said, technology is a tool. And the goal is not to do away with technology. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
Genie's out of the bottle. Couldn't do it anyway. But ultimately, we have to come to some sort of understanding. I am an advisor to a nonprofit in San Francisco called the Center for Humane Technology. It was started by Tristan Harris, who's the former design ethicist at Google, who recognized what was happening and called it out.
He was one of the first whistleblowers.
That's right. And Roger McNamee, who was one of the original investors in Facebook, and saw what happened during the 2016 election and has now basically come out against the company. And there are several other people who are important in this. Asa Raskin, Renee DiResta, these are people who work for Mozilla, O'Reilly. These are big tech companies, and I'm their advisor to explain how behavioral addictions work. So we, as a nonprofit, are working toward a regulatory framework that all technology companies can sign on to. Ultimately, we want to develop a coder's code of ethics, and also we have developed a list of harms. You can find this online at humanetech.com. humanetech.com. And the goal ultimately is to have some sort of regulatory framework in Congress, in Parliament, where these issues are dealt with upstream, rather than having to expect the user to be able to manage these issues. Now,
great news for parents, if it works.
The point is, it won't work alone. But also, individual education won't work alone either. It hasn't worked for any other substance of abuse. You expect it to work for this as well. I mean, ultimately, did Nancy Reagan's just say no work?
Nancy Reagan's just say no almost got me dead because I thought I could do it.
Well,
but
so
you
this
also
is the problem.
said something. Did you see, and this again is going to be dated and antiquated, but what you're talking about the Silicon Valley people, just this morning, and I don't know, it says that it's real and not fake news, that Google is going to the rehab business. And I was wondering as I saw this, and they partnered with an organization that I think will help buttress their legitimacy in this. But I saw this and it says, and I verified it because I'm not looking for fake news. Have you heard about this? Because I was wondering if Google is going into the rehab business. I'm wondering, does that mean that they're also going to be looking at the pandemic we're seeing in terms of technology addiction? How do you address that? How do you Google and don't do it? I was wondering, do you know anything about this?
I don't know anything about Google being in that. I do know that several players in the space recognize the issue.
Yeah.
How they're planning on dealing with it, I think, is still very much up in the air.
They've failed. I've been approached by some of these people, and I'm not going to say who they are, but it's too vast. Some of the people in Silicon Valley realize, especially for those who work within the system, so that's their whole community in life. But I wonder, and I also just wanted, because you brought this up, the thing about what we're seeing with this pandemic of child obesity. So this is your wheelhouse as well. I think this is important.
Yeah.
Well, childhood obesity and technology addiction are not that
they're
different.
They're hand in hand in sedentary lives. But I wondered about
not just because of sedentary, but because of the reward pathway and how that works. Now, you had brought up this question of genetics.
Yes.
So, like for instance, there is an allele, a polymorphism, a specific change in the dopamine receptor. It's known as the TAP1A allele.
Okay.
If you have this allele, you make 30% fewer dopamine receptors to start.
Interesting.
And if that's the case, that means you have less chance that any dopamine molecule will find the receptor because you have fewer to start with. In which case, that means you need more dopamine to hopefully occupy a receptor. Yeah. And so people who have that TAP1A allele also have increased body weight and raise their body weight faster than the rest of the population. So they have a, quote, genetic predisposition.
Absolutely.
Doesn't mean they have to act on it. Doesn't mean they're
No.
going to be obese. It's not a fait accompli, but it might be something that ultimately has some genetic potential for causing these things. There are potential genetic causes that ultimately predispose to obesity, but even if you had all of the genetics, it would only account for about 10 kilos, about 22 pounds. We have a 50-pound problem.
Interesting.
So genetics don't answer this. Ultimately, this is an environmental insult, and it has to be dealt with as an environmental insult.
Yeah.
And that means that we need a public health strategy.
Completely.
Nothing short of a public health strategy will ultimately be valuable. We need public education, of course.
Yeah.
We need parents to do their part.
Yeah.
We need kids to do their part. We need schools to do their part
Yeah.
in terms of
Absolutely.
educating kids about this problem.
Yeah.
We need for schools to take away kids' phones during the day, as France has done.
Yes. Completely.
Okay, it's something.
Yeah.
It's a start.
Completely.
But ultimately, we need the developers and we need Congress, Parliament on board.
Completely.
And I will tell you, this is a heavy lift.
Completely agree. And then for us parents and lay people out there, I guess my final question would be, what can we do?
Ultimately,
Yeah.
we have to up our serotonin, tamp down our dopamine,
Yeah.
and reduce our cortisol.
Okay.
That's what we have to do.
That's great.
Just like that.
That's very cool.
Just that easy, just that quick. How do you do that?
Yeah.
Well, there are actually 4 ways to do it. In my book, I call them the 4 C's.
Yeah.
They're all evidence-based,
Yeah.
guaranteed, clinically proven to work, or your money back,
Yeah.
except none of them cost anything, so no refunds. And they're all things your mother told you, but you forgot. So I'll make them very quick. First C, connect.
Yeah.
And that does not mean Facebook.
Okay.
And it does not mean Fortnite. It means face-to-face, eye-to-eye connection.
Yeah.
Why does that work? Well, there's an area of your brain in the occipital lobe where you see a set of neurons that transduce the facial expressions of the person you're talking to.
The mirror neurons.
The mirror neurons, and basically they generate empathy. That's serotonin.
Yeah.
Serotonin is empathy. Number 2, contribute. And that does not mean to your IRA or your 401k. That means outside of yourself, whether it be Habitat for Humanity, whether it be reading to, or tutoring other kids, or it can be philanthropy or altruism, volunteerism, depending on, who you are and how much money you have. Means to an end rather than the end in and of itself. Number 3, cope. And that's sleep, mindfulness, and exercise. So 35% of Americans are now sleep deprived. 23% are clinical insomniacs. That drives cortisol like crazy. Mindfulness is absolutely essential. Problem is, multitasking is the word of the millennium, and it doesn't work. Only 2.5% of people can actually multitask. Everyone else is serially unitasking. And that means 23 minutes to change tasks and a cortisol bump to fry your brain. And finally, cook.
Ooh.
And there are 3 items in food that matter. Tryptophan, the precursor of serotonin, and you get that in eggs, chicken, fish, not exactly processed food. Omega-3 fatty acids, again, fish, flax, and finally, no sugar.
Absolutely.
So what do we call a high tryptophan, high omega-3, low sugar diet? We call it real food. What do we call the opposite? Processed food. So we have to rethink our plate.
Fantastic. That is so helpful. Thank you so much. And Don, if there's anything else that you want to add to that in terms of what we can do.
What he said is correct, except I'm going to amend something. The smartphones are not the problem. They're just the current iteration that kids will carry around when they say, oh, let's dress like they used to dress, and they'll be carrying laptops. What's coming is these phones are going to be an inconvenience. Everything he said is correct. And, my first research study was about face-to-face versus online connection. You've heard me talk about the worry about that. My whole thing, my slogan is unplug to reconnect, all of these things. I'm going to tell the parents, model the behavior you want to see in your children, because what the kids are saying is, my parents are all about me, but my mom's on her phone all the time. My dad's on the phone at the table working. So I tell the parents, it starts in the home. Yes, these lofty ideas. One of my platforms for APA is to get it into schools. That's a long way away. It can start in the home. Yeah. So parents, model the behavior that you would like to see in your kids.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both so much. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm very grateful for your time, and I'm sure our viewers are as well. So thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Mind Health 360 show. I hope that we've helped you realize that your mental health symptoms have root causes that can and need to be addressed in order to sustainably heal, and have given you some ideas about steps you may take to start your healing journey. Please share this interview with anyone you think may find it helpful, and if you want further information, please go to www.mindhealth360.com or check us out on social media. This information is for educational purposes only and is not intended to diagnose or treat any disease or to replace medical advice. Please always consult your healthcare practitioner before discontinuing any medication or implementing any changes in your diet, lifestyle, or supplement program. Thank you.